Hey Dubbie crew, it's John here again with another video about, you guessed it, the OGL changes in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. I've got a little bit of a different video here today. As you can see, no whiteboard. I'm just going to try to do this one in person, mainly because I've got a little bit of a role play coming up, because why talk about TTRPG unless you're also going to have some RP in there? Otherwise it's just TTG. What on earth would that possibly mean? Who cares? Who knows? Because we're going to have some RP here today as well. First, before I jump into everything, I'd like to ask you please to subscribe, to like the video, and to continue leaving comments. I'm flabbergasted with the amount of response that we've had on this topic so far, and I'm thrilled to see that it seems like you guys are looking for this type of content, and you're looking to have this type of engagement throughout it. I am as well. That's my point in trying to get the channel outside of hopefully getting a channel to a monetizable level and being able to make money from it. That's really the end goal. That's what I'd be looking to do overall. That's my hope for this channel to begin with. So, in short, I'm going to go over first with the comment left by our friend Alan. To make this a little easier, I'm going to put it up on the screen and I'm going to highlight the section that I'm talking about today. In short, we're going to go into a little bit about the, I'm going to put it in quotes here, the advertising budget that the players would be contributing towards Wizards of the Coast. And it's a little bit of a summarization here of Alan's point, and I want to first remind everyone that I actually really value this comment that's been put in place. I think it's emblematic of what's been happening in the community and the types of thought processes that are here for your average D&D player. And I don't mean that in a negative way or a positive way. I just noticed that it's a very different thought process. It's emblematic of the types of people who play Dungeons and Dragons. And I mean that with the good benefits that come from that type of world building and that type of thought process. And that it comes with some costs, some downsides to having that thought process that I'm hoping to be able to expand upon. My goal in using these types of comments to give you some topics to be able to talk about that are a little different than what everyone else is showing is, you guys are great at thinking of the writer's perspective. I'll call it the writer's perspective in summary, which is that many things are connected, that there is a good and lawful side and an evil and chaotic side. And in the real world, those things often do happen, and that this would be an example of that type of thinking. I think that happens to a lot of people who play role-playing games in general, whether they're online, whether they're tabletop, because it fits the narrative of the stories that we're used to. And that is a useful and valuable tool to have, and it's something that I would recommend everyone help to develop. You guys are great at developing that side. The business side is something a little bit different, and that's more the economics of what these narratives would relate to and what they don't. And I'm helping, I hope, to try to bridge the gap a little bit between how Wizards of the Coast would be thinking about something that they recognize as a hobby, but is a business for them, and how you guys might be recognizing something that is not a business for you, or could be a business, but is primarily a hobby. And there is often a large gap between those two. Either way, again, I want to thank you, Alan, for the comment, and to summarize what he's talking about here in my understanding of it is, it's not so much that Wizards of the Coast is going to have a hit to their bottom line that's measurable through subscriptions or anything like that. That's an important point. We talked about that in a past video, but the main point that would be here is, as these players, these enfranchised players, leave Dungeons and Dragons and move to a competitor, maybe they move to play Pathfinder or Starfinder, maybe they move somewhere else or to a completely different hobby. As they leave Dungeons and Dragons, they're going to take all the other players that relied on those players creating content. They're going to take all the other players who were relying on their purchasing ability, on their spreading this hobby far and wide, and on bringing new people into the hobby. The argument would be that other players are bringing people into the hobby more than Wizards of the Coast is bringing people into the hobby, or at the very least that those two are working together, and now the enfranchised players will not be recommending that people come into the hobby of their own device, and therefore those new players would not be spending money on Wizards of the Coast or on any property that would give money to Wizards of the Coast, and that money could total tens of millions of dollars is the figure that we're using here. So, as a point, that's certainly something that could be true. What I will summarize everything with is to say it is entirely possible that Wizards of the Coast calculated that incorrectly. It is not possible that they didn't calculate that. A company this size definitely ran that scenario. They might not have taken the scenario seriously. They might have said, I think there's a tiny chance of this happening, and they did the math wrong, and there was a great chance of it happening, and it is in fact what happened, so even a tiny chance happens sometimes, all of that could add up. What I can't get to a figure that would represent anything like what Alan is talking about is on the number that would total tens of millions of dollars. We've already gone over that if Wizards of the Coast does lose tens of millions of dollars through this decision, it would still be a good calculation for them to make. That's unfortunately true. I would recommend that every single time. If Wizards of the Coast lost $30, $40 million in profit, I would still recommend them make the decision that they're making here to attempt to shut down their competitors. The reason for that is because the tabletop RPG world is growing rapidly. It's poised to grow even more rapidly. I think the main boost here came after the pandemic, but it might have just happened at around the same time. But the pandemic was a prime time for people to be having lots of ample time and a little bit more disposable income than they were used to in many people's cases to be able to start a new hobby. They had the time and the money to be able to do it, and they did it. And the data seems to show that that benefited Wizards of the Coast and their competitors too. Everyone kind of grew together as that tide rose, we could say. Great. So, in other words, Wizards will regret canceling the OGL 1.0 because that agreement was keeping a lot of enfranchised players here where they could create content and create an expanded universe that Dungeons and Dragons itself, if it was just Wizards of the Coast creating that content, couldn't possibly have dreamed of. I think there's at least some partial truth to that. It is definitely going to hurt Wizards of the Coast, I would argue temporarily, but possibly permanently, in losing some number of players who are going to jump ship and go to a competitor or are going to pick a different hobby. That is definitely going to happen. What I would be willing to bet money on, and what I would mean by that is I would certainly not consider not investing in Hasbro or anything like that. This isn't financial advice, not financial advice, but this is not something that would scare me to imagine that tens of millions of dollars in advertising revenue, as we'll call it, is leaving. And I'm going to make that the main point of the video here today. To start, I've got a personal example that I'd like to go over to try to keep this a little bit tied to the real world. To give the ending to start, the enfranchised players are certainly going to have some of them leave, and they are going to take a very large spend themselves out of the field. My main argument is most of the money that a large enfranchised multi-decade player was not spending most of that money to Wizards of the Coast, even if they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. As a quick example, let's say that you're a DM and you host a meeting with 8 players. Let's say 7 players and you as the DM, just to make it a nice even 8, because that fits around a table. Let's say you host a weekly meeting with players at your house. And let's say you've got the kind of disposable income where you have renovated your house to have a proper game room, proper table. Maybe you have cameras set up so that you can film different angles and things like that so people can see the miniatures. And miniatures, you've got a ton of them. You've got a wall full of them. You've got bookcases filled with campaign books. You use individually run campaigns, you use Wizards of the Coast branded campaigns, you use all kinds of different ones, and you guys have a blast, and you've done that with your friend group for 20 years. I don't know how on earth you managed to keep 7 friends all coming together into their adulthood or 20 years later, but let's say you did it. You are the miraculous situation that we're talking about. Let's say that over that 20 years, you've spent $200,000 on your hobby. How much of that money went to Wizards of the Coast? Less than you would think based on the hobby that you have, because when you're talking about the money that you've spent on your hobby, you're likely including money that Wizards of the Coast isn't touching and has no real interest in touching. And when I say that, if they could find a way to monetize it, they would, but they can't. For example, if you're a good host, are you providing snacks for your friends that are coming over to play? You probably are. Wizards of the Coast doesn't make any money from those snacks you bought. They don't make any money from the pizza that you sold. They don't make any money from the pencils that you're using to write down your stats. They don't make any money from any of those types of things. They could. I bet Wizards of the Coast does sell pencils to one degree or another, or someone who's licensed the property from them has a D&D pencil of some kind. That probably exists. But pizza, snacks, they don't do that. They should. And so I'm going to put this out here, free of charge, Wizards of the Coast, or anyone else who wants to brand it. I guess it would have to be Wizards of the Coast if they get their new OGL, but what you should sell would be little sandwiches that are on a roll, and they're important to have, so they're critical rolls. See, that was just off the top of my head. This is great. Either way, at the moment, WOTC has not been as clever as me and come up with something that you could sell that would be a food stuff. That's just a small example of the money can be spent in the hobby, but has nothing to do with Wizards of the Coast. And more importantly, Wizards of the Coast is not afraid of that money going to a competitor, because they're not in competition with Domino's. They're not in competition with those people. They are in competition with Paizo, but Paizo is also not going to sell pizza. They're just not going to do that at this point in time. If they could find a profitable way to do it, they would, but that's not profitable for them at this point in time. So we're going to start here with a personal example to give you an idea of what the real customer base is for Wizards of the Coast. Because I agree a little bit here with the comments that the player base are contributing a lot of things to Wizards of the Coast. But Wizards of the Coast doesn't care about players. And I don't mean they wish you didn't play the game. No, that's not true at all. They actually just don't care if you play the game. They care if you buy the products. And I think you'd all be surprised to learn that the average customer of Wizards of the Coast, from their perspective, is not a player, even though we're all talking about Dungeons and Dragons. And here's a personal example. I have here a Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook Core Rulebook 1. It's beautiful, isn't it? Now this is an old book. It's a little worn, but this is an old book that has followed me around since, I gotta look up the year here, November 2000. Hey, it's almost exactly as old as the OGL 1.0. This is about 22 years old at this point. 22 years old. This book was bought for me as a gift when I was 13. Based on the MSRP in Canada, it would have been, $31.95 at the time. I think now you could find an equivalent book on Amazon or at your local game store or something like that for, let's say, $60. So, inflation has done its damage here. The important point is this is a great book. This is a player's handbook. This is what you would start with. I just open at a random picture and you've got Lita being blown up by a cigar. We'll put that in. 13-year-old me loved flipping through this book. I loved reading it. I loved going through it. It was bought for me, if I'm remembering correctly, it was 22 years ago, I might be misremembering. It was bought for me as a Christmas in July gift. My family used to go to KOA, that's the Campgrounds of America, but it's a K, not a C, because it's a fun place, and it's fun to change letters around. It's fun. We used to go there every summer, and we would go with family. And every summer, in one of those cabins that they would have at the KOA campgrounds, for anyone who's been to one, you probably know what the big wooden logs, or the fake wooden logs, whatever they were. And we used to bring a whole bunch of Christmas decorations, Christmas lights, and Christmas trees, and we would decorate it all up. In the middle of the July heat in Canada, it was not that warm, but in the middle of the July heat, we would have Christmas music blaring and annoy all the neighbors, and we would exchange gifts. Why? I don't know. We're just weird. That's the kind of stuff that we would do. Either way, my aunt bought me the book as a Christmas in July gift. Why? I was a nerdy 13-year-old. I certainly played some sports, but I was a nerdy kid first and foremost. I used to play a lot of video games, and I used to be interested in this type of fantasy setting, so she bought me the book. That's all great. I hope you guys have similar stories of how you were able to get started, but here's the important point. Wizards of the Coast, therefore, when I was 13, would view me as a customer. Ask me an important question. How much did I play Dungeons and Dragons? And the answer is 0. I've never used this book to play a game. Not once. I have played games of Dungeons and Dragons, but it was much later on, and it had no bearing on this book, realistically. Maybe this set me on my journey, but it was a 20-ish year delayed journey, maybe 15 years. I haven't played a huge amount of Dungeons and Dragons, but I've purchased things with that property. And the important point for Wizards of the Coast is, all they care is they had a book sold. In theory, it's not even me as the 13-year-old who is their customer, it's my aunt. I promise you my aunt doesn't play Dungeons and Dragons. I promise you if you asked her this story, she would know vaguely what Dungeons and Dragons is. It's kind of a household name at this point, but she has no idea what Pathfinder is. And as a customer, she's not going to go in and buy Pathfinder stuff. She's not going to switch her purchases now because of a change to the OGL. Has she purchased other Dungeons and Dragons stuff? Yeah, probably. For her grandkids, for other family members. I think that's the most common way that Dungeons and Dragons material is sold. They're not the largest individual purchases, but there are so many more of those one-off purchases that is a gift for your nephew at some point for Christmas, or for Easter, or for a birthday, or for a graduation, or for testing negative for gonorrhea. I don't know what people buy gifts for. That's a gift reason, right? Play Dungeons and Dragons, you're fine now. Don't get into this trouble again. The point being, Wizards of the Coast views that as just as valuable as a player who plays every day but has only bought one book over the course of a year. Their annual spend, whether you receive the book as a gift and you use it to hold up your table leg because your table's too wobbly and you do nothing else with it, or the person who reads the book every single day and plays a campaign every week with it, to WOTC, you're the same. Your spend was the same. It was exactly the same. There's no difference between those two. They don't care if you play the game, and so they're not worried about losing that type of advertising money, because that advertising money is never being realized by WOTC in the first place. It's already a household name. Enfranchised gamers can convince other enfranchised gamers to leave a hobby based on that. But that's a minority of the purchases. And I can show that with data in future videos as well. The vast majority of the purchases for a product like Dungeons and Dragons, or for a game like Dungeons and Dragons, are one-off products that are either licensed and give some money from the licensing to Wizards of the Coast, or are direct from Wizards of the Coast, like a player's handbook, for example. That player's handbook, on average, I bet the majority of them that have been sold have been flipped through on occasion, but are never used to play games. That's a sad truth. I wish more people did play Dungeons and Dragons. I wish I had grown up playing it more, but the reality is, to Wizards of the Coast, I was already a pretty good customer. I bought a book, or had it bought for me. And that's going to lead me to my roleplay. Because this is now a D&D channel as well, I think it's important to throw in some roleplay, so I'm going to do that here today too. It's a nice quick one. I'm just going to go into the character introductions, and then I'll use my amazing acting chops to play out a similar scenario to help illustrate this in another way. I bet this scenario, or something very like it, is happening all the time throughout the country and throughout the world. This is how Wizards of the Coast sells most of their products. So we'll start with the first character. Hi, I'm John. I'm a local game store owner. I have a local game store here in Nowheresville. My local game store is called Big Bouncing Double D&Ds. It's a nice family-friendly store, as you can tell from the name. But I don't like the name of the store. And the reason I don't like the name of the store is WOTC are a bunch of terrible human garbage. Since they're such human garbage, I don't want to have anything to do with D&D anymore. But I have a local game store. In my local game store, I've got bills to pay, and I can't change my sign. I already have an idea for the sign. Big Bouncing TTRPG. Now, see, because I'm going to go with the competitors. I'm going to make sure that I'm just selling Pathfinder stuff from now on. I do not want to give another cent to WOTC. But to get money to fix the store and to keep the lights on and to pay the bills, I am going to still have to sell some Wizards of the Coast stuff until I've got rid of my stock. That's it, though. That's all that I'm doing. As you can see as well, I'm a typical local game store owner. I'm about 6'4". I've got nice, handsome brown hair. I'm what Burt Reynolds wishes he was with the mustache. That's the best way to describe it. Your typical local game store owner, and I bench 3 1/4. Cool. All right. So that's me as a local game store owner. Here's the next person. We'll do a nice little churn. Well, hi. My name's Cindy. I've got a nephew named Timmy, and I'm here to buy him a gift. As you can tell, my birth certificate says that I'm 48 years old, but I look 39 on a bad day. On a good day, I've got my fancy cougar print here. I call it cougar print because cougars are the ones with the spots, I'm pretty sure. I heard someone say it's leopard print, but they don't know what they're talking about. It's cougar print because, you know, it's like me, I'm a cougar. And I got it going on, and I know I got it going on. But more importantly today, I'm not out here trolling for anything except for a gift for my nephew Timmy. I love me, my nephew, and I'm gonna get him a gift. I'm gonna give him the best gift that I can think of for him. I don't often know what he likes to do. He sits there at the table sometimes rolling a bunch of dice, and I thought to myself, I remembered, you know what? I saw a movie. Well, I saw an advertisement to a movie. I was watching a different movie late at night when I was staying up late, as I do on occasion. And I remember seeing an advertisement, and I wouldn't have remembered otherwise, but it had that handsome Chris Pine fellow in it. You've seen him before. Everyone's seen him before. And it was an advertisement for a movie called, I'm pretty sure it's Dungeons 8 Dragons. Dungeons 8 Dragons, that's the name of it. I'm pretty sure I saw from the symbol there, Dungeons 8 Dragons. And I asked my nephew about it, and he said that he really liked that type of game. It said something else about not wanting to support them or something. I don't know what nonsense it was, but he wanted to support that game. So I'm going into this store, I guess, whatever this thing is. I do not like the smell of it, but it is something here. I do not... Oh, the sign's kind of clever. I do like that. I don't know what it means, but I like it. It's got a nice bouncing neon sign. That seems fun. So I'm going in here and I'm going to talk to this proprietor here in the store. Oh, he looks like Burt Reynolds. This is good. Hi, man. How can I help you? Well, hi. I'm looking for a gift for my nephew, Timmy. He wants Dungeons 8 Dragons. Dungeons 8 Dragons. Do you mean Dungeons and Dragons? You might mean Dungeons and Dragons. I've never heard of Dungeons 8 Dragons, but Dungeons and Dragons. I'll be happy to help you. Well, I have it written down here. It looks like a picture that I have. You know what? It's got that funny little symbol on it here. I thought it was Dungeons 8 Dragons, but you're right. It's got that squiggle that means and. Why don't they just write and? This is stupid. Why don't they just write and? Yes, perhaps it is Dungeons and Dragons. I would like 1 Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, great. I'm positive I can help you, but first, I would just like to tell you, the Dungeons and Dragons, they're owned by this big evil company, and you probably don't actually want to support them. I think your nephew would much prefer something like Pathfinder. It's a lot like Dungeons and Dragons, but also very different because one's by an evil corporation and this one actually likes people, and I'm positive your nephew would actually prefer to play something like Pathfinder here. Well, that was a lot of words that are not in English. We're in America. I'd like to speak English, please. So in English, maybe if I slow down a little bit, I'd like Dungeons 8 or Dungeons and Dragons in English version, please. You do speak English? Okay, yeah. So not trying to be rude or trigger someone here at all. I'm just pointing out you probably actually would rather have this Pathfinder book. It's a lot like Dungeons and Dragons. Was it a book you were looking for, or was it something else along those lines? You're not really sure. Do you know what your nephew would be using it for? And again, I'm positive he would prefer Pathfinder. No one really wants to play Dungeons and Dragons anymore. Well, I am positive that he would like to play Dungeons and Dragons. It's the one he plays at his table. He's got the little dice and he rolls them around with his little nerd friends, and they're not out playing sports the way that I would like, but they are absolutely also not satanic. And I was worried this was satanic, but it's got that nice Chris Pine character in there, and he would be only doing something that God would approve of. So I'm positive that that's the case as well. And I would really just like this product so I can leave your establishment, I guess. Oh, okay. I'm really just pleading with you. Like, I would love to give you the Dungeons and Dragons if it weren't for the fact that it's a really evil big company that is doing terrible things. I'd much rather support this Pathfinder company here. And I'm positive your nephew would. Wouldn't you like to support something that's a smaller company that's nice and friendly and is helping people? And I can tell you all about the OGL. So they have this license that they were letting other companies access for free some of their material, and then they stopped doing it all of a sudden. And I know they're allowed to stop doing it, but I didn't want them to stop doing it. Well, as you were spouting all that gobbledygook over there, I looked up on my phone and I can see that I can get the Dungeons 8 Dragons. I'm pretty sure it's Dungeons 8 Dragons. And I can get the same book as I see right there for $5 cheaper and will gift wrap it. So I'm going to leave this establishment now, but you're a strange fellow. You are handsome yourself, I do have to say, but I don't think anyone would ever come in here in this store again, and I certainly wouldn't recommend anyone do that. I'm going to go make this gift delivered to my house now, to my nephew Timmy. Thank you very much for your time, and bless your heart. Scene. I know, I'm going to let everyone calm down for a second here, but scene. If you think that is atypical outside of the conversation, there was a little bit of artistic flourish there, obviously. Outside of that, if you think that scene is anything other than a typical Dungeons and Dragons purchase, you're completely wrong. The average purchase is by someone like an aunt, or a grandparent, or a parent, who is familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, will never be familiar with Pathfinder. And when I say they're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, if they see someone with a die with more than 6 sides, rolling it on a table, they might know that's Dungeons and Dragons. That's it. That's all anyone will know. If you don't believe me, well, I would question that you talk to your friends, talk to your parents, talk to someone who you know doesn't know about Dungeons and Dragons, and ask them if they know about Dungeons and Dragons. Ask them if they know what that is. Maybe you have to explain it a little bit to them. You know, it's the game where you're rolling dice. But they've heard of that. Most people have. Now, go find someone else with the same level of knowledge as whoever you ask the first question to, because the most common answer you'll get is, oh yeah, Dungeons & Dragons, they'd still do that? Okay, fun. That'd be the most common answer that you would get for D&D. Go ask someone else what Pathfinder is. Just ask them. Ask anyone that you'd like that isn't immersed in the hobby what Pathfinder is. You'll probably have to explain what it is, and the common answer you'll get is, oh, like Dungeons & Dragons. No one knows about the other companies. Dungeons & Dragons doesn't really have to worry about word of mouth because they already have saturation in the market. They already make up such a large share of the market, they don't have to worry about word of mouth. Where they do have to worry about word of mouth is for established players moving established players to another established enterprise, but the share of players that are there are certainly disproportionately large in the amount of purchases they make, but it's such a tiny sphere of the total purchases that are happening, it just can't move the needle that much. It certainly can't move it to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. All of that said, let's leave that aside for a second, and in a quick conclusion, what I'd like to end this video with is, let's say, for sake of argument, that Wizards of the Coast really is going to lose tens of millions of dollars in advertising specifically. And advertising meaning not their own ads that they're putting out, because they're not putting out anything close to $10 million in ad spend. I can put up an article here on the screen that I think is from 2019, but is indicating that Wizards of the Coast's total advertising spend is more like $500,000. So word of mouth is just not accounting for that much, but let's put that aside and let's take the best case scenario for anyone who would like to see WOTC taken down a peg, okay? Let's say it is $20 million. Cool. Can that advertising offset what's coming in March 2023? The D&D movie. I alluded to it here in that roleplay. That might have gone over everyone's head because it was just so well done that what Cindy was talking about is actually a thing that's coming out. This was set in the future, I guess. Essentially, you've got an A-list movie with Hugh Grant, with Chris Pine, with lots of other actors and actresses in it that looks like they're attempting to garner some of the attention that would be on, say, the Avengers movies right now. They're looking for the same type of style movie. The important part is this is an A-list movie that's released in theaters worldwide. How's it going to perform? And do you think for a second that that advertising isn't going to push D&D to the forefront of people thinking about buying gifts for nephews, for nieces, for aunts that are looking for another gift to buy, for uncles that are looking for a hobby to get into with their kids, for parents that are looking for something that reminds them of their childhood because they might have played D&D growing up too? Many of those people are not aware of the franchise, and they are suddenly going to be aware of the franchise again. Not one of those casual purchasers, and by not one I do mean there is a small number, but it's such a tiny number that it doesn't matter. Those people are not going to see that movie. They're not going to see the advertisement for that movie because they are absolutely advertising the movie. They are not going to see how D&D has pushed again to the forefront of people's thought processes. They're not going to give any care about an OGL license change because they don't know what that is, and they're never going to know what that is. And they're not going to care about any competitor. They're not going to care about Paizo. They're not going to care about looking at games that are like Dungeons & Dragons. What they're going to say mostly is, I didn't know Dungeons & Dragons was still a thing. And then when they're looking to purchase a Christmas toy for someone, when they're looking to purchase a birthday gift for someone, and they're thinking, what else could I put in my kid's stocking? They're going to have something branded from a movie that that kid saw, and it's going to be Dungeons & Dragons branded, and they're going to give their money to WOTC. That's how it's going to work. The advertising that players can do amongst themselves is nothing compared to the advertising of having a giant movie come out. Even if Wizards of the Coast is going to start losing tens of millions of dollars through that word of mouth, they are going to garner so much more from the giant advertising campaign that they have coming out in the role of a feature-length movie. That's just reality. I wish that wasn't the case. I do. I don't know that this is going to be good for the hobby overall, but it is. I hope that helps put the advertising concept into scale for everyone here. And until next time, I'll be coming out with another video here on this topic to continue through these comments and the comments that other people have left, so I want to thank everyone again for those, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye!